Hi, friends. My name is Tina Schramme, and I serve as one of the pastors here. It's such an honor to be here with all of you today. This is a weird story, and many people struggle with it, and pastors are no different. We have to struggle with some scriptures and wonder, why is this in here? What is important about it? Why did Jesus curse a fig tree? And what was he really trying to say? This scene takes place on the day following the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. So think back to Palm Sunday. This happens right after that. It happens during that Holy Week time that we normally celebrate right before Easter. And Jesus has entered, and everybody's hosannaing and hallelujahing and all those fun things. And after his entry, in the verses just before our passage today, it says, Jesus visited the temple, looked around at everything, and returned to Bethany to spend the night. Interesting. Why does Mark tell us this small detail? He wants us to know something, that Jesus went to the temple, he looked around, he didn't really say anything or do anything, and then he left. And this sets the stage for our verses today. Jesus gets up the next morning and heads back into Jerusalem. Jesus is hungry, apparently, and sees a fig tree. Looks to see if he can find some fruit on it, but finding none, he curses it. Now, sounds a little bit like a temper tantrum, doesn't it? It doesn't sound like Jesus. I'm hungry. Let me see if this tree has some fruit. Nope. All right, curse that tree. It just doesn't seem like what Jesus would normally do. And keep in mind, this is not during fruiting season. If I told you, when do bluebonnets come up in Texas? March, April, spring, right? During the spring. So if in November I cursed the ground because there were no bluebonnets blooming, that would just be silly, right? This is the same sort of thing here. This was not fruiting season, and Jesus, along with everybody else, would have known that. It even tells us that in the passage. So if you think this is a bit odd, you're not alone. Why did Jesus take out his anger on this poor fig tree? Why curse it? A few people have comments about this. William Barclay said this story does not even seem worthy of Jesus. New Testament scholar T.W. Manson said, this is miraculous power wasted to serve Jesus' ill temper. And Bertrand Russell, the philosopher who wrote an essay called Why I Am Not a Christian, used this narrative as one of the reasons he didn't believe in Christianity. He said, this scene shows Jesus as a furious man, unable to control his anger, not worthy of the title Son of God. Pretty harsh words, yeah. But it's because it seems out of character for Jesus to curse something. This is where it's important to read the Bible with a critical lens. It's helpful to understand context. It's helpful to understand literary devices, the setting, the writer, the audience. These help us find clues in the meaning of the writing. So we have 4 Gospels, 4 different perspectives, and each of those were written for different audiences, by different people, for different purposes. They were all trying to communicate different aspects of Jesus. This helps us. In these verses, there was a common literary technique that's called a chiasm. It's basically a sandwich. So you have the beginning of a story, then you break and have another part of this, another story, and then you go to the third and you go back to the first story. You finish up the first story. So it's like a sandwich. And Mark uses it so much that it's often just called a Markan sandwich. That's what it's called because Mark uses this in his writing so often. The technique here is used, and the meat of the sandwich is usually in the middle. That's where you get the understanding for the story that's on either side, okay? So it's important to understand this, to understand the meaning of this story. The first slice of bread in this sandwich is Jesus seemingly getting mad at a fig tree, and he curses it. Now remember, Jesus had visited the temple before, the day before. So he knew what was going on in the temple. He knew what was frustrating him and what he was upset about. So when he sees that fig tree, you got to see it in light of the temple experience. We stop this story after he curses the fig tree, and that's when we go to Jesus in the Temple Mount. Now, many people think that Jesus is cursing because they were doing money exchange in the temple. And that's a tiny bit of it, but really what it's about is that people were being taken advantage of. When you came to the temple, you were supposed to bring an offering of some sort. Most people brought animals. And if you lived close by, you could bring a big, nice offering, right? You could bring a cow or a calf or a sheep. You could bring a goat. But if you lived far away, you weren't going to travel with that large animal for that whole way. So you would come to the temple and you might purchase doves or some small animal of some sort for your offering. You also had to they had made rules that you had to use a certain kind of coin. Only the Jewish kind of coins could be used in the temple. So you had to exchange your money. It's like if you went to Mexico and you needed to change for pesos, and they only accepted pesos. That's what you had to do. You had to use the Jewish money. So if you had other coins, Roman coins, you had to then exchange those for Jewish coins to be able to use in the temple. So basically, they had set up a bunch of rules that made it very hard to just come in and worship. They had made it difficult. They had made it difficult for the travelers. Can you imagine when let's see, who here gets excited about, what's the concert that comes? Two-Step In, thank you. Who here gets real excited when all those people come to town for Two-Step? Yeah, that's what I thought. So you can imagine, in this town of Jerusalem, it just swells with people at these times of year when they're celebrating a festival. And so they were upset about that. So how do we deter so many people coming and visiting? Then they also wanted to deter the Gentiles. I mean, the Gentiles weren't real Jewish followers, right? They may have worshiped this God, but they weren't circumcised. They didn't follow all the purity rules of the Jewish people. What? They think they're just going to show up to the temple and worship this God? We're not having it. So they had made all these rules and ways to keep people from worshiping God. Now, God had promised to bless Israel through the temple. That was the original promise, is that God was going to bless the chosen people so that they could bless others. He was going to bless everybody through the chosen people. So when Israel sort of began to take that for granted, they used the temple and the promises made to them as an excuse for unjust behavior. They forgot that this blessing was for everybody and not just for them. It was Jesus condemning the temple and the people for their corruption of it. And that's why Jesus quotes Jeremiah. He says, God's house has become a robber's cave. It's not that they were exchanging something. It's that they were using exorbitant prices. They were making rules that made it very difficult for people to come and worship. It was about taking advantage of people. Jesus was frustrated with his fellow Jews and Israel as a whole because they abused their role as the holy and set-apart people. They kept forgetting the full promise to them that God was going to bless them so they could be a blessing to others. They kept forgetting that. Instead of becoming a light to the world to draw others in, they became judgmental, unfair, unwelcoming, hypocritical. Have you ever heard anybody described like that? A lot of non-Christians describe Christians like that. Some of those reasons are the very reasons that people will put on surveys that they don't want to come to church, that they don't want to be a Christian, that they don't want to be a part of this movement because they see people as Christians as having too many rules, as being hypocritical, as being unfair and judgmental. The temple was intended to symbolize God's dwelling with Israel for the sake of the world. But it had come to symbolize not God's welcome, but God's exclusion of them. It became a place that was exclusive, that you had to do all just the right things to get in to worship God. The temple became a place where it was hard to find God. You could easily say this about a church. The church became a place where it was hard to find God. How did the temple get to this point? It wasn't just one big decision. It happened incrementally over time. That's how everything like this happens. Instead of welcoming people, they began to take advantage of people. They kept putting more rules on themselves, and therefore that made them superior because they were following all the rules and nobody else was. They said if you don't have the right kind of coin or the right sort of sacrifice, or if you're a Gentile, you can only go to certain places in the temple. They just kept making it more and more difficult. Over time, the temple had become the opposite of what it was intended for. The Jewish people, who were meant to produce fruit like the fig tree, who were meant to be loving and kind and generous, had become selfish and self-focused and judgmental. Peter points out the tree after they left the temple. He says, and Jesus says, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them." Prayer here represents the new way forward. You see this cursed fig tree? You see this cursed temple? Prayer is the way forward. Reconnecting to your roots, to who you are as a people. That's the beginning of your connection so that you can produce fruit. The fig tree and the temple both represent a faith, a ruthless faith, a fruitless faith, a corrupted faith, and a bunch of rules about who's in and who's out. The tree and the temple need to reconnect to its source. The people need to reconnect to their source. Jesus concludes his prayer on this when he says, "And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive your sins." So you can see it's about praying. It's about humbling yourself. It's about getting back to your roots. Jesus is saying to these people who have developed all these rules and all these ways of shutting people out, we are called to be humble, to admit our own sins, to admit our own faults, our own reasons why we shouldn't be going to the temple. If you're going to make rules for them, well then I have to live by those same rules. If some people are out, then all of us are out. Remember that the people had forgotten that there was a chance to be a blessing for others. They were being blessed. They were the chosen people so that they could bless others. Let me tell you a story. In the 60s, Chuck Smith was a pastor of a little church in Costa Mesa, California, right on the beach, right off the beach. It had been in existence for a long time, but was dying slowly with fewer and fewer members. And one day, Chuck got an idea and put out signs saying everyone was welcome to come as you are. Well, God began to move in that little community. You can imagine a lot of young people started coming to church. They would come right off the beach. Chuck welcomed anyone and everyone, straight from the beach, without shoes sometimes, without shirts sometimes, with their surfboard in tow. They would come in covered in sand. Their feet would have oil stains on them from, the oil that gets on the beaches, and they would have oil stains on them. They were covered in sand, sometimes still wet. They didn't know any better. It said everyone is welcome, so they trusted that and they came. On the beach, they were themselves, and when they came into this church, they were beginning to feel welcomed as well. One day, Chuck arrived to find a sign hanging on the door. His people that had already been there probably weren't super excited. Can you imagine here in our church if somebody walked in without shoes? They walked in without their shirt, walked in with their surfboard or their luggage in tow, their bags over their shoulders, with ragged clothing perhaps, with dirt on their feet, stomping in and getting mud and dirt around everywhere. You can imagine what was going on in these people's minds. So he shows up this day, and there's a sign hanging on the door. It says, "Shirts and shoes required." He took that sign down, and he met with his church leaders right after church that day. And they, after much discussion, decided that together they would rip up the carpet, they would replace the pews, they'd do whatever they needed to not hinder one person from coming into that church. They were reminded, and they reminded themselves, that they were there to be blessed so they could be a blessing. That church was there for everyone. That's the good news, because that's the heart of Jesus. God tears down barriers for us. Jesus made a way, and he made it pretty simple. Pray, seek forgiveness, forgive others, stay connected to me, keep praying, keep forgiving, keep loving, and you will produce good fruit. Don't be a gatekeeper for God. God doesn't need gatekeepers, not one. God does not need a gatekeeper. God does not need us to tell anybody the rules. God needs us to love people, to open the gates, to open the doors as big as we can. That's what God calls us to do. This church, like the original temple, is a church of prayer for all nations, for everybody that walks in. This church is a church for all people. What are we doing? I encourage you to think about this week that might act as a barrier for people coming in. What do we do or say, or what signs do we have, or what ways do we function that might tell people you're not really welcome here? We say you're welcome here, but we don't really act like it for certain groups of people. How do we do that? How do we do that as individuals? What do you say to the world? How do you behave in the world that says, I love you, but I don't really want to, associate with you? Which really means you don't really love them, right? God calls all of us to use what we have to be a blessing to others, to open our doors and our hearts wide. And that's not easy to do, friends. I get it. We all have our preferences. We all want to be comfortable. We don't want to have to deal with the dirt on the floor and the wet seats and the whatever else comes in with people. But that's what we're called to do. Following Jesus is simple. It's not always easy, but it is simple. Pray, stay connected to your source, forgive as you've been forgiven, seek forgiveness, love well. Pretty simple, but not always easy. And God calls us to do the hard work of being a church that is a house of prayer for all nations and all people. May it be so. Amen.